All right, my name is Dan Holden. I'm the CTO and Intelligence Director at the R-CISC. The R-CISC is the retail ISAC. You can find me at Desmond Holden on Twitter. If you're wondering what that's all about, I was named after the guy from Hacksaw Ridge, if you've seen that movie. If you're wondering, only about probably half of this presentation is actually retail specific, so quite a bit about this is just about malware and threat landscape and cyber criminal activities. So, you know, if you're not into shopping, you know, there's plenty of other things to hear about here. But I do want to start off with some background information. As we all know, retail has been the target of many high-profile breaches over the years, going back to, of course, TJX and Heartland Payment Systems and eBay. Of course, the biggie that everyone likes to always talk about, of course, is Target, shortly after Home Depot. And that is where the R-CISC really started. Those very large breaches, end of 2013 going into 2014 was how the retail ISAC came to be. We are currently about a little over 100 members with over almost 600 brands. That's generally how retail is measured because many retailers are responsible for many, many different brands. And as any security pundit will tell you, brand damage is, of course, one of the biggest impacts in any sort of breach scenario. So protecting those various brands are very important. So I mentioned we're an ISAC. We are responsible for helping disseminate threat intel information between our members, whether that's our vendors, which we refer to as associate partners, and our core members. Of course, providing that ability to exchange information, also being able to broker relationships between these various entities so that they can better exchange, and also providing an opportunity for them to collaborate with each other. So we do many different events and working groups throughout the year, trying to, of course, put these companies in situations where they can learn from each other, mature and understand the threat landscape from a retail specific vertical. Now, I show this image because retail is an extremely broad term. It's not like a lot of other verticals where, you know, the picture in your mind essentially covers the whole gambit here. So retail covers a lot of different things, including hospitality, even large ISPs, right? So there are large ISPs, of course, that sell mobile phones and sell the service, and of course have brick and mortar sort of stores, and of course online presence. So when you think of retail, I think most of us, you know, think of a situation where it's mainly brick and mortar. But as we all know, so much of retail these days is, of course, also online, and that is also where so much of the modern fraud is occurring. There's also, of course, gift cards and all of the financial fraud related with that. So a lot of our members are not just retailers, but also folks that are involved more on the financial side. So there's a lot of connecting points into retail. So it ends up being a bit broader than one might suspect. Retail also is a bit different than the other verticals because we have a different sort of attachment to retail. Of course, again, always talking about the Target instance, you know, that was the one instance where not only the CISO got fired, but of course also the CEO. But as many people have pointed out before, the stock price of any of these companies when they initially get breached does dip, but almost always recovers. And of course the question is why? Do security breaches not matter at all, or is it just because, of course, eventually we're just going to shop there anyway? So retail is a bit different because, again, there's very many different touch points, and we are attached to some level to many of these retailers, or especially the brands. And that's why branding is so important, regardless of what that brand is. There's a lot of marketing effort, and of course the employees of any company is the most important part about building a brand. All of us at some level is likely attached to a brand, whether you work for a company or you're a vendor or whatever the case might be. Branding is very, very important. Nobody ever walks around and just says, oh, I love politicians or I love my government. That's more of a rare scenario. And I realize we're close to DC, and some of you might really do love government or employees or politicians. But it's even rare that you might actually say that, you know, a government entity is your favorite. I mean, nobody loves the TSA. You know, so retail is different because we do love retail. We love retail brands, and of course that's why there is such a thing as retail therapy. Shopping makes us feel better, buying things makes us feel better, and of course we are dirty capitalist Westerners, and that's kind of what we're all about, consumerism. But that's also why this is such a rich target. And that is why, of course, retail is at the core of so much financial fraud. So when we say financial fraud or we think about that, many times we're really picturing more of the financial companies. But retail is many times either the direct target or the middleman for a lot of the financial fraud that takes place. But I want to talk about that retail attachment for a moment. This is one of my old dogs, Ruger, if any of you are familiar with the firearms industry. And I've had many dogs, and I currently have many dogs. This is one of my current ones. This is Louis Vuitton. So I try and cover both sides of the gambit here. And I have a lot of different dogs. Not all of them are named after brands. But these two dogs were named after men of history. Bill Ruger Sr. and Louis Vuitton were, of course, gentlemen that were responsible for their companies, and there's a lot of rich history involved in those brands and those companies. And again, that is of course what any company will try and get you attached to. Any company wants to tell its story, why it matters, where it comes from. And these two brands and these dogs are kind of examples of that. But what is the threat landscape look like for retail specifically? What is, I guess, special about retail? Because every vertical has to deal with, you know, mal spam and, you know, malware and various issues that make the threat landscape somewhat common across victims. But there are some things that are very specific to retail. And if you asked a retailer who their scariest adversary might be, they might very well tell you Brian Krebs. Since Krebs, of course, is the one where so many of us learn about retail breaches. And I say this completely joking. Krebs actually keynoted our Retail ISAC Summit last year, so he's, of course, a great resource in the industry. But there are a lot of retail breaches highlighted on his site. Of course, Target was, which is, of course, why this picture is funny, because he's a Target. Recently, I think he covered quite a few in the fast food industry. I think Arby's, both Chipotle have been recently mentioned on his site, and certainly if you don't follow Krebs, I would certainly recommend doing so. If you asked our vendor friends out there, and I come from a vendor background, which is why I like to pick on them, but of course then it's stock photos of cyber criminals, which always end up looking like, you know, some ninja or you know, ski mask sort of character here. But of course cybercrime has been with us for a very long time, but it of course has changed drastically as various money-making scenarios have changed, and especially as technology has changed. Our keynote this morning, Ron Gula was talking about the cloud, was talking about how things had changed over the years. And of course, cybercrime really is a reflection of how our infrastructure has changed, right? The attackers follow us where the new infrastructure is, right? So when we enable things like virtualization or cloud or IoT or BYOD, right? All of a sudden we are expanding that attack surface. And as retail moved from traditional brick and mortar to more online offerings, of course, attackers followed us there. Attackers have also followed us because, of course, we're going towards a more cashless society. Even buying a gift for someone these days is such a challenge that gift cards have become a really easy and nice option. So the attackers follow us there, and I'd say most often the attackers in retail are probably what you think. It's generally, of course, Russian, Eastern European sort of characters. most of cybercrime is generally based out of these geographies. However, that's the great thing about cybercrime. Really anyone can do it. There's plenty of it that occurs in the US and all around the world. So it is a very open and level playing field. And that is why, of course, it is so popular. From a attacker standpoint, retail doesn't have to deal with some of the other threat types quite as much. APT, for instance, generally isn't that big of a deal for most retailers. Now, I mentioned earlier, ISPs. Certainly, they do have to worry about that sort of scenario. If you're any company involved in retail, but you're also involved in very heavy intellectual property sort of businesses, obviously, APT sort of scenarios are of concern. But if you are a traditional brick and mortar sort of retailer, more often than not, China is not so much your concern, generally Russia, Eastern Europe. And I say that because retailers, and I'll close with this later on, but retailers do worry about attribution and are concerned with who's after them. We've heard so many, of course, buzzwords and nauseating terms over the years. APT is one of those sort of terms that is not going to get you a product sold very readily. So I want to cover one of the things that is fairly specific to retail. And this is one of the things that our members discuss quite often. That's account takeover and gift card fraud. If you can kind of put yourself in the retailer's shoes for a moment, the difficulty with this is, of course, trying to figure out the intentions of a user. Any one of us goes to a retail website and we sign up and we want to buy some goods and services. We are a legitimate user, and of course they embrace us, love us. The issue is that account takeover does exist, and then all of a sudden a legitimate user is no longer always legitimate. And this is where the majority of issues arise. This, of course, is why changing your passwords, of course, is always mentioned. This is why attackers do care about your private email and all of your various accounts, because those accounts many times are reused, and they can use that to go after other accounts that you might have. And of course, as we're all annoyed by, there's very few websites these days that allow you to check out anymore as guest. And we have a zillion different accounts to take care of. And we might only buy something from a particular website, once or twice and never think about it again. But that account is still active. And that, of course, is a risk for both you and your credit card, and of course, the retailer as well. Then, as a part of what I would call modern money laundering, is an illegitimate user that is set up from the start in order to do purposeful money laundering. And so, what happens with all of those stolen credit cards? Well, more often than not, they are used generally in a retail sort of scenario, and I'll cover that in a moment, in order to move money from one area to another. Generally, that is moving money from the US or North America to Eastern Europe. So let's cover some of the lower level activity and what is very common with account takeover. You can see here again stock photo of a scary guy in a hoodie. Left to right, you have the criminal that has done the account takeover. You've got a website, and this is multiplayer gaming website, so it doesn't sound scary. Any of you can go to it right now. It doesn't sound like any kind of hacker forum. And that's the interesting thing about account takeover. The barrier to entry here is insanely low. I mean, I'm literally going to show you how to do this right now, and there's a zillion YouTube videos on this. And that's kind of the point. This is the lowest level of cybercrime. This is the level of cybercrime where if you just want some coffee or to order a pizza, this is what this is. This is not any massive, money-making scheme. So you've got the criminal that has the accounts. These will be posted on the forum. Then you've got someone that wants some cheaper coffee or pizza and will buy them from the actor on the forum. And then, of course, you've got loss for the vendor or the financial institution. So again, this is super, super easy. Some of you might have heard of a tool called Sentry MBA. This has been covered extensively by a company called Shape Security. Been around since at least 2011. You can see here when version 1.41 was released, everybody was super, super excited. So super excited, you can see there's 1,733 tabs on this conversation when this thing was posted. And you might be wondering to yourself, what is the conversation? What possible conversation could be occurring to that level? Well, it was mainly just people saying thanks. Thanks for enabling us to rip off all of these companies because pizza's good, coffee's good. One of our associate partners, I just pulled a quick snapshot off of one of their websites. This is an Intel provider. And you can see here 156,000 posts related to Sentry MBA. So this is kind of de facto standard used by everyone for account takeover. Here is a screenshot of the most recent version. Basically, and again, you can YouTube this. You post. You are going to put into this tool, generally speaking, a list of proxies, because of course you don't want to know where you want things to be the least trackable they can be, or traceable. And then you've got a config that you load, and that's essentially it. You basically put in the proxies, you put in the config, and as you can see, there's a big button that says go. And so it does its work, and then you end up with a bunch of popped accounts. And you know, you're probably familiar with some websites where you can put in your email address and see if you've been owned and that sort of scenario. That is, generally speaking, you know, what's going to come out of this. You know, common citizens like ourselves that have just been unlucky, probably, you know, to no doing of our own, these accounts just end up being out there for some time, and you know, somebody's going to get breached, or you know, your information is out there somehow, and so it ends up getting traded. You can see here the config if you were wondering where to go get a config. There's the website. You can see at the, apologies for the feedback, you can see at the bottom 369 total configs. Essentially, there's, generally speaking, a config for each target. So if you wanted to order pizza tonight, there would be a specific config for one of the pizza delivery services. And you would load those in, again, generally speaking, with your proxies and pull all your accounts. Then you can be the cyber criminal that posts things up on the message boards here. Or, of course, you can just buy a bunch of pizza and coffee. So speaking of coffee, this is actually an example off of Krebs' site from a number of years ago related to Starbucks. And you can see exactly what this looks like. Posted by that noob. These are accounts, and you can see most of them 5, 10, 15 bucks, and he's selling them for just a few bucks. And all of a sudden, of course, your muffin and coffee are much cheaper. You can see at the bottom, accepts PayPal and Bitcoin. But he does mention at the other, kind of at the bottom here, a bit of a PS. There are plenty of others. And if you want to just buy the config from him, he will also just sell that. So that way he gets you know, a larger chunk of money rather than the few dollars at a time here. So he says, hey, make me an offer if you want the config for this. Now we'll come back to this posting in a minute because the story continues a bit more. You can see another example here. This is for Kohl's, you know, an obvious popular brick and mortar fashion retailer. Basically, any retailer you can think of is a possibility here. You can see here even the tech stuff is extremely popular. The technology vendors are really popular, especially for big financial fraud. So if you're doing smaller stuff, yes, it'll be the pizza, coffee sort of scenarios, or even, you know, fashion retailers. The moment you get into really big financial fraud, you're generally talking about the Dells, Best Buys, Microsofts, PlayStation, you know, that sort of scenario. So here you can see a specific actor. Wanted to be able to provide you with a few specifics here. We did just a little bit of light research. Similar sort of scenario, most of these actors will provide their Skype. That's generally how the communication takes place. He's got a long list here of various retailers. He seems to be operating out of Georgia. I have the IP there, you know, as Putin will tell you, that's not proof, but the name kind of matches the IP, I would say. So he's been around quite a bit. He's actually on the exact same message board that I showed you a minute ago, the multiplayer game one. There was some other actors that were also fairly popular at the time putting this talk together, Vevo Tech, Mad Diablo. Like I said, the barrier to entry here is pretty low. So, you know, these guys will just make up a quick handle. They can always make up another one, jump around on message boards. So there's not the extensive effort of kind of hiding your tracks or being very elusive. And there's no barrier to entry for these attackers on these message boards in terms of, you know, other, you know, attackers know them, or you have to be sharing information, or, you know, in other words, there's no dark web, deep web nonsense about this. It's on a multiplayer website. You know, again, anyone can do it. Now this one's kind of interesting because this is actually giving away gift cards. And so this guy has this long thing about gift card giveaway. And you might ask yourself, why in the world would someone on one of these things give away gift cards? Well, obviously, this actor has a ton of them. And if you go down to the PS, you will see if you want to increase your chances of getting a higher amount of e-gift card codes, then feel free to put a link to my forum thread in your signature. And so this ends up being a bit of an advertisement for this actor, where his credibility, of course, goes up, and anytime he sells anything of a more significant amount, I would imagine these e-gift cards are very low dollar amounts. Obviously, his reputation will precede him, and he will be known as, you know, something of a very strong actor in this this particular forum. So as we've seen in many malware sort of scenarios or cybercrime advertisements, whether it be DDoS services or packers or whatever the case might be, of course your reputation does matter even at these lower levels. Now, I mentioned that Starbucks thing earlier. Well, the comments of it were pretty hilarious, as many Krebs articles are. And this guy, Mark D, asked, please, what's a noob? Because in the article it said, in most cases, a flurry of fraudulent account activity targeting a major brand is preceded by postings on noob-friendly hacker forums, which I've been highlighting to you. And then, of course, somebody had the brilliant idea of saying, oh, the delicious irony of the noob asking what a noob is. But what is a noob to do? So I've showed you, you can just go to the forums, you can buy these things, you can download Sentry MBA yourself, you can crack these accounts. But what if you really don't know, like, anything? Like, what if you don't know much about YouTube, besides, cute, kitten videos? The way financial fraud gets really big is with the folks that are sitting at home looking for some, activity to do to keep them busy or make some money. And Facebook, of course, is full of these sorts of things. These are just ripped off from Facebook, mom's working from home, or how do you make money at home while, watching awful daytime TV. These sorts of people are the ones that are targeted as what's called drops. And so when fraud gets really big, what you're doing is you're laundering not at the lower level with gift cards, but you're laundering at the higher level with those technology products I mentioned earlier. Right? So if you can buy a laptop or you can buy a camera with a stolen credit card, you then need to get that good out of the US and over to Eastern Europe. And that's what a lot of these are. And so you can see here, this is an example of an email where they recruit drops. And on the message boards, many times the attackers will ask about tips and tricks for recruiting drops. It is certainly possible that people are naive enough that they don't understand that they are involved in criminal activity. It's possible that they're just desperate for the money and don't particularly care at that point in time. And then, of course, it's entirely possible that they're aware and they know that they're, you know, involved in money laundering, and, you know, but there's not much to it, right? You receive a package from someone that bought the product with a stolen credit card, and your only job is to repackage it and send it to Europe. So, not much to it. You can see here primary responsibilities. It sounds pretty professional. I mean, that's kind of the point. They really don't want to lead you on that this is a legal activity. They even wish you success in your endeavors at the bottom. You know, the salary for the first month, not too bad. So they try and make it as polished and looking like a proper operating business as possible. This is how you get really, really large-scale money laundering and financial fraud. And as I mentioned, the retailers are generally a part of this because, of course, yes, the core of this fraud is stolen credit cards, but what are you going to do with a stolen credit card? You're generally going to buy something at a retailer. And that good ends up being bought in the US and then being sold very, very cheaply in Eastern Europe. All right, moving on to retail breaches. These sorts of things certainly occur when Target happened, when Home Depot happened. There was a lot of coverage of point-of-sale malware. I mentioned earlier about, you know, what did the attackers look like? What kind of threats were retail up against? Point-of-sale malware certainly still exists, still happens, but the types that were used just a few years ago really have kind of, you know, gone by the wayside, and it is I'd say less of a threat than it was, you know, just, you know, 3-4 years ago. However, certainly has not gone away and certainly does occur. This is actually an example from the recent Chipotle breach. This sort of attack is occurring all across restaurants and fast food operators right now. So it certainly is not just Chipotle or Arby's that had previously been mentioned. So I can say I would not be surprised if Krebs ends up having more stories of a very similar nature. Obviously, for fast food and restaurants, you know, that is a potentially more complicated situation. As you all know, many of these fast food operators are franchisees. Being able to scale is, of course, very, very different when you don't own and operate all the various stores, right? So there's a lot of challenges with helping to secure these types of organizations. You can see this is the typical sort of, you know, phishing example. This is still how it all happens, right? We all know WannaCry, and every vertical is hit with these sorts of attacks. Simple RTF file. As is usual, the attackers will check things right before an attack on VirusTotal. As I always remind people, you know, AV are not the only ones that use VirusTotal. Attackers do constantly. Of course, being able to bypass AV is not difficult, and that's why these things are checked. So again, typical sort of scenario happens all the time. This is just, I would say, the everyday sort of example of what anyone is up against, not only in retail, but really, you know, across the board. This morning, our keynote mentioned the cloud, and the cloud, of course, is opening all sorts of new opportunities for attackers as well. Same thing when VoIP became a thing, right? Then we had vishing. Well, in this example, you have something that looks like your cloud email, but you can see the URL is not very well disguised. But the point is, the more we get used to something as human beings, the less likely we are to be paranoid. And that's, of course, what the attackers are after. That's why phishing works so well. That's why malspam is probably one of the greatest attack vectors right now. There's some that believe, and I think someone mentioned that this week, that malspam is probably the product of probably about 8 different threat actors. So there's not a whole lot of folks on the planet that are responsible for all that malspam we get. A lot of folks have tracked it down to about 8 different actors, and they, of course, just pump out tons and tons of spam that ends up having some sort of malicious link or attachment, and that's what ends up getting most folks. In this case, you have something that's a little more polished, and the hope is, of course, that you're used to seeing Office 365, and you end up clicking on something you're not supposed to. This is another, of course, attack vector besides the tried and true email. Now, what is likely to end up on your system when you click on something you're not supposed to? Here we have an example of malware called Adwind. And I'm going to go through a couple different pieces of malware here. These are the most common types of malware that our members have been seeing this year. So yes, these of course are all over the place. Every vertical probably ends up seeing these. I just wanted to cover the ones that retailers see the most. This one's interesting. It's been a lot of different things. It's been around for a while, since 2012 or so. It was first RVAsec RAT, Unrecom RAT, Alien Spy, JSocket. Most recently, I think it even has another name and essentially generation of this malware family. Many AV vendors will simply label it as Adwind. It is interesting because it is Java-based. And as we know, Java will work on any sort of platform, which is what makes this, I guess, a special type of malware, because it will go after Mac, it will go after Linux, assuming you've got Java installed. As with most malware types, right, the moment it gets leaked, it really expands massively, becomes kind of de facto standard, and is used, customized. Generally, you've got multiple generations that happen, and it is used for a lot of various activities. Generally, you know, it could just be used to drop something else. You can see here kind of a simple control panel, very similar to many control panels. You can see here a particular Adwind campaign. Again, sort of a mal spam sort of scenario, or potentially a targeted phishing, but just asking for, you know, invoice sort of stuff. This did end up hitting the retail sector. You can see the file is a jar. And of course, again, if you have Java installed, that's exactly what these threat actors are after. This particular one, the command and control was in Moldova. Also linked to a dark comet, remote access Trojan. Again, many of these types of generic malware are then just used to drop something else. That's kind of the point about, I think, both cybercrime and even APT activity, is there is so much off-the-shelf malware that anyone can use and then just simply customize to your campaign. So even though these things are known by AV vendors, matter of fact, probably the best write-ups on Adwind are from Kaspersky, it doesn't particularly matter, because you have custom packers, you have the ability to check against AV vendors. Even though something is known and documented, doesn't mean it is detected. And so just because we read about a particular threat doesn't mean, oh wow, it's going to be caught every time now. It just doesn't work that way. So I mentioned, again, you've got to have Java. So that's the good part. You know, if you're an elite Mac user, you can always brag that, oh, I don't get owned by such things. But if you do have Java, then you can. So there's a reason why everyone tells you not to touch it. Here is one of the more recent generations of this, called Alien Spy. There are a few YouTube videos on this if you want to watch this in action. If you're wondering what that flag is, that is Bulgaria. You can see here a lot of the various functions of this, sort of the things you would assume. Password stealing, key logging, camera, microphone. Like any modern software, of course, it has the ability to add new features. And so Alien Spy has a whole list of plugins, which are essentially just, you know, features that you can add to it, that just increase the overall functionality of what you might be wanting to do. So again, you can customize it to your particular campaign and what you're after. And this is kind of the scale that, of course, cybercrime has reached these days. Is, you know, I might not be after, you know, very, very detailed stuff. I might not want to be spying on a particular user. I might just want to rip off as many passwords as possible. Well, then I can customize these tools to do exactly that. Or if you want to get down to the, I want to, you know, watch webcam and I want to steal photos and that sort of thing, you can do that as well. A lot of this also has stuff for even ripping off bitcoins from the user. So there's a lot of different options here. It's not the it's the sort of scenario where really, again, you can customize it down to any level that the cyber criminal might want. And that's why these off-the-shelf malwares are so popular. So I mentioned VirusTotal earlier. The problem with VirusTotal is the moment you upload your malware, then all the AV vendors do have it. And so now there are services on the underground where you can check your malware against the AV vendors but not give it to them, which is really, of course, the nice scenario that most attackers want. In this case, you can see this one is got some creepy looking Minotaur on it, Toro scanner, and again, you just upload your malware and it will tell you what the detection level is. Now, this is not to say any of these services are a holistic view of the antivirus industry. I don't want to paint it that way either. You know, a lot of vendors have various ways of detecting things. Now, I agree with Ron from this morning's keynote that you know, they can sell you a bunch of fluff about machine learning and AI, but I'm also not going to pretend that everything is signature based. You know, there's certainly heuristics and behavioral detections that occur, and most of this is basically a test on static detection. So I want to pick on them, but at the same time not sell them completely short. One of the final ones I want to cover here is Pony Loader. This is also very, very popular. We see this quite a bit. Typical sort of scenario here. I would love to highlight the features for you, but of course it's all in Russian. But it is a credential stealer. It generally is loading some other kind of malware. So again, these sorts of off-the-shelf things are used so commonly because, again, they can be customized. This is basically a builder where you select your various options for what you want your malware to look like. In a typical scenario, you'll use a builder like this. You'll choose, you'll hit a couple checkboxes. Name your file, whatever you want. Then you will go to what is referred to as a packer service, and you will pay someone else to then basically obfuscate your malware and make sure that it is undetectable by AV. So even if something like Pony is very well known, again, by the AV vendors, you will build your malware, then have someone else obfuscate it for you, and then off to the races you go. So there are services to the cyber criminals to make sure they can bypass AV. Got an image here of a recent campaign using command and control in Serbia. Hopefully you're catching on to the trend that has been here all along, which again is Eastern Europe. Again, you can see at the bottom static detection of only 37% of vendors. So the AV detection here was quite low. Very sort of typical scenario here. This is the last malware sample I want to cover. And this one's really interesting because it's what's referred to as fileless infection. And this is one of the things that gets a lot of discussion between the Intel folks across our membership right now. This is Kovter. It is basically, it will check to see whether the machine has PowerShell. If it does, it will launch some JavaScript, some shell code, and it uses the registry to do all this, and then will delete the original file point of infection and carry on fileless. And when you reboot, the registry will relaunch the code and make sure that you're still infected. So this is an increasingly popular type of malware because, of course, if you don't have a file, very, very difficult for AV to detect you. And so this is just another way for them to bypass security products that they know we all have. So I wanted to cover, all right, we've discussed retail. We've discussed why retail is important, different, why it's leveraged so heavily by cyber criminals, but what are these retailers doing? And that, I would say, is the good part. Yes, everyone talks about those old breaches, but those breaches occurred, and of course those companies got funding and leadership and are in much, much better positions than they were. So I wanted to mention a few things on gift card fraud. You might have even experienced this. I actually spoke to someone this week that said their drugstore around the corner would only accept cash for gift cards. That is not a great option, but it is certainly the easiest option because, of course, if you're paying in cash, they know you're not paying with stolen credit cards. Obviously, we finally have chips in this country. So having EMV compliant gift cards is growing. That's probably the most common thing that most are doing. You can also limit the number of cards that are sold in a particular time period or in a single purchase. Obviously, if you show up or if you're online and you buy a ton of these things, that can potentially be suspicious. And that's what a lot of the retailers end up doing, or the folks involved in gift cards. They're also monitoring behavior, trying to trigger on any sort of thing where they've seen any level of campaign from cyber criminals. So that's pretty common as well. Now, what about on the defense side overall? I think every conference I hear Intel discussed a ton, and certainly I've heard it at this one. There was a great presentation yesterday about threat intel platforms, and this is a huge interest area, I will tell you, for the retail vertical. I personally, even though I enjoy picking on vendors, I really like the threat intel platforms because they are useful at any level of expertise of these organizations. So if you're elite and you have this huge team and huge investment, threat intel platforms are great. If you're really small and don't have tons of expertise, skill set, folks, budget, they're still quite valuable. Because the great thing about a threat intel platform is they allow you to scale not only across your own vertical, but past your own vertical. And I would certainly say that an ISAC should be, the very first thing any organization does. If it was up to me, it'd be probably a part of all the standards, but you can't force anyone to pay for things or be a part of things. But it's a very cheap and effective way to be a part of a group of organizations that are sharing information for the betterment of each other. And a threat intel platform is another way to do that. Things that vendors do. Passive DNS, botnet monitoring, which you can do both from a sinkholing standpoint or even participating in the botnet yourself. These are things that some of the more elite folks will do, both in finance and retail. Threat actor tracking is definitely something that is done. No one really cares about attribution to the, because they want to know, who's after them, but they want to know why and how. And so threat actor tracking is definitely something that is done from a TTP standpoint so that they know what they're up against and they can track campaigns over time. That is definitely the type of intel that is exchanged across our membership. And I have been blown away, pleasantly surprised with how many of these retailers actually employ reverse engineers and can do their own reverse engineering of malware and find out, hey, is this spyware that I don't care about, or is this a campaign targeted after us, or is this something that we're seeing across the rest of the retail vertical? So that's also very nice and something that is done. I would say that is the number one question, I think, in any vertical, especially if I'm a CISO. It is this just me, or is this happening across the vertical? And I think that is a very good question for anyone to ask, whether at the analyst level or the CISO level. Am I being targeted, or is this a very broad campaign in which I am a part of? And that definitely comes up in overall intel sharing. I'll get to you in just a second. So wrapping up here, entering questions, I did want to thank a couple of our associate partners. Again, I like to pick on the vendors, but I like to give credit where credit's due. A lot of those images and the research I was able to do is thanks to these folks: Shape, Flashpoint, Intel 471, SpyCloud. Some of these vendors are smaller. Some of them you might not ever heard of. But they're also the ones that are doing the work on the Intel side and trying to help these organizations find information that is pertinent and specific to them. And a lot of the big vendors do not go into those sorts of endeavors. So wanted to highlight these vendors here and thank them. Want to open it up for questions. I have one right here. Yes, sir. Yeah, I mean, of course, obviously that is a very broad topic of whether, what will actually, highlight to attackers or criminals that they don't want to be involved in this, sort of scenario. Of course, as we all know, the issue with cybercrime is that it's international, and international complicates things. Well, it reminds me of of course, Cuckoo's Egg book from Cliff Stoll. He was able to make it happen even back in the 80s. It does remind me of the recent bust, though, where the cyber criminal went on vacation, and they got him while he was out of country, at the beach. So it certainly does happen, and of course, you saw those FBI. Those were all legitimate busts. So it absolutely does happen. We do work with law enforcement, both locally and internationally, and certainly that's what everyone would like to see. But it's not as much as I think everyone would want as well. So, any other questions? Yeah, actually, that's a really good question, and that's one of the big things for the R-CISC in terms of futures is growing past, the large, anyone that you would suspect in retail is basically a member, and as we know, the retail is huge. So going down into the lower rungs of it really is our mission now. We do that especially around holidays and that sort of scenario. And I would say, the R-CISC now is 2.5 years old, and the last 2.5 years have been about building that foundation for these larger at-risk retailers. But the future is certainly going after the smaller ones and helping them build more mature programs like these larger operations. So yes, and hopefully a whole lot more of it. Other questions? Yes. That is an excellent question and something that is actually debated. Generally speaking, it's going to be the one on the financial side, which is why we have financials involved on the retail ISAC. If you are an issuer of gift cards, then you are the one being put at risk. It's the same. It's almost like, why did Microsoft get so invested in security, even though it wasn't their applications that were always insecure, right? It was their OS. And it's kind of the same issue here. While the retailer is being used as kind of that front, many times it's the gift card issuer or the credit card issuer, of course, that is the victim. PCI wasn't about protecting us as users or customers, right? PCI was about protecting the credit card companies. And so generally speaking, it's on the financial side. But it is something that is often discussed. I got the STFU. It was my whole mission. I really appreciate you guys sticking around and asking questions before lunch. Thanks so much.